After the guns of the Great War fell silent, the world's navies found themselves in unfamiliar waters, not of combat, but of politics. In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed, an effort by major powers to prevent another arms race by limiting warship size and firepower. For the Royal Navy, it meant a painful compromise. Their once unrivaled dominance would now have to conform to strict limitations. No battleship could displace more than 35,000 tons, and no gun could exceed 16 inches. Within these constraints, something bold began to take shape. A battleship that would challenge the very idea of what such a warship could be. That battleship was HMS Nelson. Nelson was laid down on December 28, 1922, at Armstrong Whitworth shipyard, on the River Tyne. Her sister ship, HMS Rodney, followed not long after. And from the start, they were unlike anything the Royal Navy had built before. Rather than refining old designs, the Nelson-class battleships were a complete and complex rethink. To fit within treaty limits, while still mounting heavy armament, naval architects made daring choices. All three of Nelson's main turrets, housing 9 16-inch guns, were placed forward of the superstructure. This all-forward arrangement had never been tried on such a scale before. It made her instantly recognizable. Shorter with a more compact silhouette and a single, tall funnel amidship, Nelson looked like a ship from the future. But the design wasn't just about looks. Concentrating the main battery forward allowed for a shorter armored citadel, saving weight that could be spent elsewhere. Her armor protection was formidable, better than any British battleship before her. She also had internal anti-torpedo bulges and a unique, layered belt system. Her 16-inch guns, the only of their kind ever mounted on a British battleship, could punch through any known armor at long range. Yet, boldness came at a cost. As revolutionary as HMS Nelson seemed to be, she had faults. The engine layout was compromised to save space, placing the machinery in a compact midship configuration. This made her vulnerable to flooding and damage amidship. Her speed was limited to just 23 knots, slow by battleship standards, even for her day. And worse, her handling proved sluggish. She had a wide turning circle and was prone to heavy rolling in open seas. Crew accommodations was also poor, with vibration and heat problems stemming from her poor propulsion layout. But still, when HMS Nelson was commissioned into the Royal Navy in August 1927, she was hailed as a masterpiece of treaty-era design. A symbol of ingenuity under pressure. Alongside HMS Rodney, she represented Britain's determination to remain a naval superpower, even under the eye of international limitation. For over a decade, Nelson patrolled in relative peace, a floating deterrent, more than a weapon in action. She served as flagship of the home fleet, visible at major reviews and royal occasions. But beneath the ceremonial pomp, a storm was building. By the late 1930s, Germany had cast off the restraints of Versailles. Hitler's Kriegsmarine was growing bolder, and war once again loomed on the horizon. The Royal Navy began to shift from peacetime routines to wartime footing. Ships were modernized, drills intensified, and Nelson, already aging, was inspected for readiness. She was powerful, but her limitations were no secret. Her engines had never been overhauled. Her top speed was considered borderline unacceptable. And her damage control systems, while innovative, in theory, remained untested in the fury of battle. Then, in September 1939, the storm finally broke. Britain declared war on Germany. HMS Nelson was called to battle. Assigned to the home fleet, Nelson's first mission was to protect the British Isles and intercept enemy merchant raiders. Yet it wasn't the Kriegsmarine surface fleet that struck first, it was their submarines. On October 30, 1939, Nelson sailed near Loch Ewe, a sheltered, Scottish anchorage. There, she struck a German magnetic mine, laid by U-31. The explosion ripped into her bow, Flooding forward compartments and blowing back bulkheads, Nelson, already slow, was now crippled. She limped back to port for repairs that would end up taking months. It was a grim lesson in modern warfare. No matter how thick your armor, no matter how big your guns, a single mine could cripple a giant. But Nelson would return to the fight. The battle had only just begun. By early 1940, HMS Nelson had returned to service after months of repairs. The mine damage she suffered near Loch Ewe had been a stark warning. HMS Nelson, with her slow speed and rigid internal layout, was not built for quick escapes. Throughout 1940, Nelson resumed her duties with the Home Fleet, escorting convoys and maintaining a steady British presence in the Atlantic. But her design, that had been so advanced in the 1920s, was starting to show its age. While her guns were still unmatched, her speed made her a giant plodding guardian, often outpaced by the very ships she was meant to protect. Her all-forward gun layout, once considered a brilliant weight-saving idea, now complicated firing arcs and made her awkward to balance in heavy seas. Sailors would often joke that she plowed like a bulldozer through the rough sea. Even so, her crew learned to work with what they had. HMS Nelson could still hit hard, and her thick armor gave confidence to those aboard. Then came one of her most dangerous chapters, Operation Halberd. In September 1941, the British government was desperate to resupply Malta. The island had become a crucial forward base in the Mediterranean, but Axis forces were strangling it with relentless air raids and blockades. The Royal Navy organized a large convoy operation to break through the blockades. HMS Nelson's massive guns and thick armor were chosen to serve as the flagship of the operation. It was a calculated risk. Nelson's speed, or lack of it, made her a tempting target. The Italians and the Germans knew the British would have to send heavy units. And sure enough, on the 27th of September, while escorting a convoy through the Mediterranean, the attack came. German aircraft, mostly from the Luftwaffe elite torpedo bomber squadrons, swarmed the formation. Nelson was hit squarely by a German aerial torpedo on her port side, near her stern. The damage was severe, and flooding knocked out her steering gear. Once again, she had to be towed back to Gibraltar for emergency repairs. A battleship, feared across the world, had been forced from battle by a single aircraft-launched torpedo. This wasn't just bad luck. Nelson's design, so focused on armor and firepower, had limited anti-aircraft capability and poor underwater protection at her extremities. The very compact machinery layout that made her efficient on paper became a curse in action. Repairs were difficult, and flooding could threaten critical systems more easily than on more spacious ships. It was becoming increasingly clear the Nelson class, though formidable in theory, were out of place in a fast-changing war. Carrier air power was rewriting the rules. Battleships were no longer kings of the sea, they were becoming easy targets. Yet Nelson endured. After further repairs, HMS Nelson returned to the fleet in mid-1942. And this time, her mission would take her far, far from home. The British were planning something big, Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Nelson was selected to support the landings at Algiers. Alongside American and British cruisers and destroyers, she would provide heavy bombardment if needed, and act as a show of force. The goal was to secure a foothold on the African coast and begin pushing the Axis threat back from the south. On November 8, 1942, Torch began. HMS Nelson didn't fire a shot that day. Negotiations with the Vichy French forces in Algiers kept things relatively peaceful, but her towering presence sent a message. The Allies had arrived, and they were not leaving. For Nelson, it was a strange kind of victory. Her guns remained silent, but her value wasn't in shells alone. Her sheer presence, battered but still unbroken, gave weight to the Allied advance. The Mediterranean was also changing. The balance had shifted. And Nelson, once again, was sailing into history. By 1943, HMS Nelson had earned a quiet kind of respect. She wasn't glamorous, nor sleek or fast, not free from scars, but she was still there, and her story was far from over. As the Allies prepared to strike at the soft underbelly of Europe, Nelson took on a new role. Not just a ship of war, but a ship of politics, diplomacy, and presence. Her first major task that year was in support of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, in July 1943. As British and American troops came ashore under fire, Nelson's 16-inch guns opened up on fortified Axis positions. The thunder of her shells echoed across the coastline, fortresses crumbled, and bunkers collapsed. It was classic battleship work, and HMS Nelson, slow but steady, was right in her element. It was a brief return to the kind of war she had been built for, delivering crushing blows to shore targets from a vast distance. But what came next was something no one expected. Just 2 months later, HMS Nelson was sent on a very different kind of mission, one that didn't involve firing her guns at all. In early September 1943, Italy formally surrendered to the Allies. But getting from surrender to cooperation wasn't simple. There were still German forces in the country, and tensions ran high. The Allies needed a show of force, but also a neutral space where negotiations could happen safely. They chose HMS Nelson. On September 29, 1943, in the Bay of Malta, on the battleship's broad wooden deck, Italian Marshal Pietro Badoglio and senior Italian naval officers came aboard to sign the Armistice of Malta. The setting was deliberate, British strength, but with dignity. It was a surreal moment. For decades, battleships had been symbols of war and destruction, but here, Nelson served as a stage for diplomacy, her presence lending legitimacy, her guns silent in the background. After the ceremony, HMS Nelson didn't sail for home. The war wasn't over. By early 1944, she was back in action, taking part in operations to support the Allied landings at Anzio, Italy. Though Nelson herself didn't fire during the initial landings, she remained nearby, ready to provide heavy fire support if needed. Her role was increasingly that of a floating fortress, offering moral and material backing to ground troops slugging it out with coastal guns and the like all along the Italian peninsula. But there was always risk. In June 1944, while patrolling near the coast of Algeria, Nelson struck 2 acoustic mines, laid by German aircraft. The blasts tore open her bottom, flooding compartments and damaging her shafting and steering. Once again, Nelson was badly hurt, not sunk, but too wounded for frontline service. She was towed back to Gibraltar, and after a full assessment, it became clear HMS Nelson would not return to major combat operations again. Her design, so revolutionary in the 1920s, had become increasingly difficult to support. Her propulsion machinery, packed so tightly into a short length, for armor reasons, made repairs frustrating and complex. Her steering system, located aft and with little redundancy, had proven vulnerable time and time again. And despite upgrades, her anti-aircraft defenses were still not on par with newer warships. The writing was on the wall. But she had one final duty. By 1945, HMS Nelson was transferred to the Eastern Fleet, arriving in Colombo, Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, as Japan's empire began to crumble. She didn't engage in combat here. Instead, she became a command ship and representative of British authority in the Far East. And then, as the war reached its final moments, HMS Nelson was given the honor of witnessing another surrender. When Japan announced its surrender in August 1945, HMS Nelson was ordered to Sabang, off the coast of Sumatra, and then onward to Penang, where British forces were to reoccupy the region and accept Japanese capitulations. And so, in early September 1945, just days after the formal Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri, another ceremony took place aboard HMS Nelson. In the warm waters off the coast of Malaya, Japanese commanders boarded the old British battleship to formally surrender their forces in the region. Once again, Nelson stood not as a weapon, but as a witness. Her decks were quiet, her guns pointed skyward in salute, rather than in anger. It was a symbolic moment, the last of her kind, overseeing the end of a war she had survived, from beginning to end. She had never faced the great fleet battles envisioned in her design. But she had endured a torpedo strike, mine blasts, air raids, political tensions, and shifting roles, not a glamorous record, but a meaningful one. By late 1945, HMS Nelson returned to Britain. She would never again sail to war. The post-war years were not kind to battleships. The age of naval aviation had arrived. Carriers, submarines, and guided weapons had replaced the thunder of 16-inch shells. Ships like Nelson, with their towering superstructures, massive crews, and slow speeds, were now outdated. And yet, Nelson still lingered. She was decommissioned in 1947, but she was not immediately scrapped. For several years, she served as a training and accommodation ship, a floating monument to a different era. Crews came and went, and her engine stayed silent. By 1949, the decision was made. After 27 years in the Royal Navy, nearly all of them eventful, HMS Nelson was sold for scrap. In 1950, she was broken up at Inverkeithing, her steel fed into the hungry post-war economy she had helped defend. She died not in battle, but in peace. What was HMS Nelson's legacy? She was revolutionary, but flawed. Her all-forward main battery layout was bold, even brilliant, but it came at a huge cost. Her tight internal machinery spaces, clustered to protect vital components, made repairs incredibly difficult. Her single rudder proved a repeated weakness, exposing her to damage and control loss in multiple incidents. She had fewer secondary guns than her predecessors, and her narrow beam made rolling in heavy seas uncomfortable for her crew. Yet despite it all, Nelson served longer than most warships of her generation. She became a symbol of Britain's interwar resolve, a stabilizing presence in times of political crisis, a gun platform in Mediterranean battles, a diplomatic stage for surrender ceremonies, and a representative of the Royal Navy to the very end of World War II. She never won the glory of ships like Hood, Warspite, or Prince of Wales. But she endured. Nelson was not perfect, and in a century of change, perfection matters little compared to action. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. You can also subscribe and explore our channel for previous battleship videos. Bye for now and Godspeed.